Hey, this is the Wandering Home podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Mays. And today I have one of my favorite artists for a long time is Andy Gullahorn. He's been writing very creative and thoughtful music for a long time. And so I'm excited to kind of dig into your story, Andy, and kind of talk about some of the emotions and ideas behind your songs and really just get to know you, kind of know who you are and what brought you to songwriting and music. So man, thanks for coming on here. I really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me. It's good to meet you.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of just, I guess, get started by talking about your upbringing. You're from Austin, is that correct? Austin, Texas?
That's right.
Okay,
Just outside of, basically Austin, Texas, and on a little farm outside of town.
I got you. I'd heard, so what type of farm was it? Cattle, I guess, or
So it was kind of, my dad was a lawyer and a lobbyist, so it wasn't like that's what we did. It was essentially a hobby farm for him. It's like 150 acres, and we did have some cattle out there.
yeah.
It was in different times we leased it out for cattle, but when I was there, growing up through high school, we kind of had our own cattle and kind of ran that. But it was, for 150 acres, that part of Texas, that's like 20 head of cattle that you could have on that space. So it's not like super huge.
Yeah. Yeah, I was so your dad was a lawyer and I guess that's why
hmm
y'all were so close to the Capitol.
Yeah.
Okay. You did
Yeah.
a lot
So
of work over there.
we lived, when I was like second grade, we moved out, on the outskirts of town to this farm. But our school and the church we went to was like all right, basically on the campus of the University of Texas. So it's like right in the middle of town.
You Longhorns fan, I'm guessing? Or
Yes.
you almost have to be,
Yeah.
right? It's kind
Yeah. Grew up a Longhorns fan for
of
sure.
like being from Alabama. We're all, well, some people are Auburn fans, but most people
Yeah.
around here in Birmingham are going to be diehard Alabama fans. So well, that's cool. And I heard before you grew up Catholic. Is that correct? Going to Catholic school?
That's right. We went to St. Austin's Church in Austin, Texas, and uh, went Catholic school all the way through high school. So our church had a school from kindergarten through eighth grade that I went to, and then there's one Catholic high school that was on the exact opposite side of Austin from us. So it was like a 45-minute drive each way. But that was, Catholic schools all the way.
Okay. So is that so? I'm trying to think of the perspective. Like 3% of Alabama, like where I'm from, is Catholic, and then I'm guessing Texas is that's kind of a more normalized, or
You know, I don't really know. I think it probably would be more so than Alabama.
yeah,
Partially because you have huge Hispanic populations there. So in Texas,
yeah.
but I didn't know any other, that's just kind of the world that I grew up in. So I wouldn't even know how to compare it. I don't know.
Anything else? Were you?
Yeah.
I know, like now you're kind of in some evangelical groups at times outside of that norm. Were you any there? I mean, was there any like even like with your faith younger? Were you
Totally.
was there any
Yeah.
evangelical background?
Yeah. So the church that I grew up in, being on the campus of the University of Texas, is a Paulist, uh, under the Paulist order. Like, as far as Catholic churches, it might have been. I was also being on the campus of the University of Texas, which is a pretty liberal institution
Yeah.
in a pretty liberal town of Austin. Right? So, but it was also very ecumenical. Like I remember just being exposed to all different kinds of things, and my parents were also very Catholic, but very spiritual first. Like wherever you're going to find God, that's a good place to find God. So I can remember, I never really felt like there were these big divides between us and other churches. It was just kind of like, oh, there's good things at every place. And I remember my mom taking me, our rivals growing up in our school were the Baptists across town, of course, like Hyde Park Baptists.
Oh
They,
yeah.
we always played them. They were the big rivals. And I remember my mom took, it might have been, the youth group from our church. Youth group at Catholic churches was not normally very strong, but this was a small group of kids, and we went to see, what's his name, Josh McDowell. Wait, is that his
Oh
name?
yeah, yeah, yeah. The youth speaker and all that.
Yeah, youth speaker.
Yep.
He was speaking at Hyde Park Baptist, and a whole group of our Catholic kids went to go see it, and it was. I remember it being really awkward because he was doing like an altar call and like, and all of us Catholic kids were just still just sitting there listening, we're like open to it.
Yeah.
But he's like, if you're sitting there and you're not listening to God and you need to get, we're like, hey, let's just go ahead and go back there, and so that he stops yelling at us, whatever. So we had that experience. I also grew up going to a kind of a sports summer camp
Okay.
called T-Bar M in New Braunfels, Texas. And that was very evangelical. So I have a song that I kind of joke about this, but every year it was like, they're like, what day were you saved? If you die tonight, you're going to heaven,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And I was like, I don't know. I was baptized when I was a baby. And, so I would get saved pretty much every summer because they felt like they needed to save me. But that was very evangelical. Like I even up working there as a counselor, and
Okay.
our training would be to go to the Riverwalk in San Antonio, and we had to witness to three random people, which was terrifying for me.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's
So I was kind of exposed to all kinds of things growing up. So
yeah. Me and a buddy had actually talked on one of these episodes before about some of my background, but some of that evangelical stuff when we were growing up, I'm almost 40. So I grew up in like late 90s, early 2000s. But some of that stuff was funny. Like we were talking the other day because Halloween, we had these things called judgment houses that were haunted
oh yeah,
houses where you basically went to the judgment seat and then they took you to hell and everybody got saved, you know? And I had a ton of conversion experiences, you know what I mean, throughout my teenage and younger years. So,
I did,
oh, go ahead.
honestly I didn't experience a Judgment House until I moved to go to college in Nashville. We went to I remember going to one. Do they always like have rooms like with a car accident where they like turn up the heat and okay, yeah,
Yeah, if you know what's
that's
funny,
something.
it's like you don't think about it till later, but you're like, that is pretty messed up. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that's I might need to go see some like a therapist for that later on.
Yeah, yeah.
Like it's kind of wild. I can tell somebody that your music really reminds me of a lot of times is Flannery O'Connor and
Oh, wow.
and as I got to hear some of the Catholic elements in your songs, that connection was even more, just because of the raw lyrics and the willingness to talk about real things and suffering was, is a really cool thing, I think. Do you think that some do you think that your background as a Catholic kind of has played into some of that? The willingness to see suffering and tough times?
Man, that's a great question. I actually think about this a lot because I ended up working in a world where I'm around a lot of the evangelical Christian world, but even as just as a songwriter, writing with different artists who are in that world,
Yeah.
I always felt like the language that I grew up with, and the way that the lens through which I saw the world was always a little bit didn't work in like the CCM kind of evangelical world completely didn't completely work there. And I started to see some of that was because I think of the Catholic imagination that I grew up with. It's just a different thing. And the funny thing, you mentioned Flannery O'Connor. I'm a huge Flannery O'Connor fan, but I wasn't for years. People would tell me, you need to read Flannery O'Connor. And the truth is, I don't read a whole lot of anything, but they would say, you would really love Flannery O'Connor. And I was like, well, I don't know who that guy is, but I don't think I'm not going to
I
read
had
his
the same
books.
thing. I thought it was a dude for a long time.
Yeah. And then a friend of mine, Jonathan Rogers, wrote this biography about Flannery O'Connor. And he gave it to me and told me I should read it. And I read it, and I fell in. I mean, just her story. I just fell in love with her, and I started reading her stories and her books, and I was like, wow, somebody should have told me to listen to this a long time ago, which they'd been telling me for years. But I'm not saying that my writing is anywhere on the level of Flannery O'Connor, but what I could resonate with is I think what you're talking about is like I felt like reading her stories in a very different way. she was trying to accomplish the same thing I was trying to accomplish through songwriting, which is kind of to make space for all of the human experience and to find God in the midst of the grittiest of it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and I do think that in my experience of writing with people who grew up in all different kinds of faith traditions, but particularly in the evangelical church, for whatever reason, my growing up Catholic, I think of the many benefits that it has given me. I think I just inherently have, I can walk through terrain of hard things and dark things and mystery a little bit easier than some of my friends feel like they can. I don't know if that makes sense,
No,
but
it definitely does. And before we came on here, I was kind of telling you a little bit about my background. I was a Reformed Baptist preacher, and now I was confirmed on St. Patrick's Day this past year as a Catholic. But I could definitely see those two differences. It's almost kind of sunshine rainbows at times. I'm not saying everybody is, but at times it is in the evangelical world. And then in Catholicism, I found an embrace of the suffering. Not a glorification of it, but really an embrace of it and an honesty, that of the human condition and where we're at. And so that was very comforting for me, especially because the reason why I'm no longer a pastor is I had a moral failure as a pastor and then had to step away and had to recover for years and found my healing
Mhm.
in the Catholic Church because of that.
Mm.
And your
It's really
music
beautiful.
definitely shows that. Do you think that your view of like, and we'll get more into this later, but you are definitely grace centered in your music, and centered around the love of Christ and the fact that God can love anyone and actually does love everyone. What do you think? Typically people have to go through some really tough times to get to that mindset. Was there something in your life that kind of shifted you towards that and gave you an empathy for people, or was that something instilled in you, from your family or church?
I think it's probably a mixture.
Okay.
I think there are, like, when I look back at the kind of songs and stories that I was drawn to growing up, and then when I started writing songs, songwriting for me, there was always this element of grace to it. Maybe some of it was aspirational, like hoping that it's true.
Mm,
So yeah, def that's always kind of been a part of just how I'm wired, personality. I mean, you can go into all different kinds of things about that. But then to have my life experiences, it's kind of like as I started to experience great failures and disappointments and just walking through hard seasons,
mm,
then it kind of gave flesh to the way that I kind of hoped the world worked.
mm,
Does that make sense? So maybe I would write about that before, and then I would go through it and be like, oh no, now I know as much as I can know anything.
mm.
I know that this is true,
Yeah.
or I want to believe this is true. So yeah, I think it was informed by the way that I was raised and what my experience of the world was, but then also my experience through my own failures and dealing with grief and all this kinds of stuff. Where it's like, oh yeah, this is. It just so happened that the kind of the worldview that I was moving forward with really fit what my experience in the world was.
Mm.
And I will say that I'm not, as far as like grace and I am not a theologian. I've never, I don't even think about songs in that way.
Mm.
But I just think of uh, what I want to be true about God, what I experience of God, um, and sometimes I write things like that, and people are like, "Oh, that's like along these theological lines." I'm like, "Okay, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm no official theologian, but it's certainly a mixture
Yeah.
of my own life experience, which I think is part of like what I think is interesting about your movement to the Catholic Church too is one thing I always loved about the Catholic imagination and the way the Catholic Church is set up is it does actually, I think, value um, our experience in this world
Mm.
as far as the formation of our beliefs.
Yeah.
and allows me to feel like, oh, I can trust what my experience is. I'm not saying trust that it's the capital T truth, but that I'm not always having to take my experience and be like, well, I'm going to pick it apart and be like, oh, this is right, this is wrong. It's like, well, this is what my experience is,
Yeah.
and this is God made me this way, and I can kind of trust it. I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, it does. It does. And I think that's what drew me to it was Catholicism is more of a pilgrimage. It's not a like a conversion experience, and then you constantly look back to what had happened to you. And that is so being reformed, we were huge on grace, grace alone, and in faith alone. And really what shifted in me was that that theological idea didn't really work when I failed. It was kind of strange. It was like we would always preach, grace, it's through grace alone, through faith alone. And then when I felt failure, I really felt, and this is probably a lot of self-imposed things, but I felt furthest away from God than I ever had before. And also from the church. And I found a way back to him through Catholicism because it was not something that I was looking back to, like a conversion to look back to, but it was a something to look forward to every day and a constant resting in Christ and running to him and finding grace every day. Not that I had found it before. Does that make sense?
totally.
Yeah, and so I that's what really drew me to it, and also the fact my Catholic priest, Father Bob, is hilarious. He's like the most laid back dude I've ever met in my life. And when I went to confession and like confessed my sin, of course, being a good Baptist, I came back and was like still wearing, what I had done. And he said, "Did you confess your sins?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, then stop." He's like, "Dude, it's over with." And that was just such a comforting thing to think, dude, like, not only does God think that, but he thinks that, you know what I mean? So
Mm.
I wonder, do you think some of that, knowing that God, being able to confess your sins, knowing that you could run to God and him give you reconciliation, do you think that really influenced some of your theology and mindset of God?
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't thought about that specifically. What I always found was interesting is, like kind of growing up in this Catholic world, living in these evangelical circles, especially at that camp that I used to work at, where people would like argue with me about stuff all the time,
Yeah,
and they'd be like, "Well, you Catholics don't like the Bible. You don't know the Bible. You don't read from the Bible." And I was like, actually, most of our service is from the Bible.
yeah,
Like most of the liturgy is just there's probably more of a percentage of reading from the Bible than there is at any other service, but whatever. But particularly around confession, it's kind of like what you're talking about talking about grace and confession. People are like, well, why do you need a priest to go confess something to? And like you can just, which yeah, that's right. You don't need the priest to go confess something. But for me, what I love about it is sure anyone can do that. You could confess to God or to another person, but people don't do it.
right. Yeah,
You just don't do it.
yeah,
Like having a vehicle where you can experience it bodily, where you can sit in front of somebody
yeah,
and talk about bring your shame out into the open,
yeah,
and somebody for that person to not run out of the confession booth or run out of the room and just be there and be able to hold it for you and say, remind you that you're forgiven.
yeah,
To I think the ways that through the liturgy and through some of these sacraments that those things are actually embodied
mm,
is the most important part. And so I think I would hope that some of my songs would feel an embodied version of what forgiveness is like and what grace is like, and not just a theological concept. Because I think my experience of a lot of in the evangelical world was like, oh yeah, you could confess whatever, but without that vehicle for it to really be embodied,
yeah,
most people didn't do it unless that's because of some moral failure or getting into recovery or something. Unless you found yourself in spaces where you needed to
Yeah.
to do that. And then that's why in those spaces, whether it's a 12-step room or in therapy, people would, that's the first time they'd be like, oh, I'm actually experiencing this, and I'm experiencing it outside of the church,
Mm.
in a way where there's there are places that are safe places to share, and I can experience God's forgiveness through a person sitting across from me who's hearing it from me and is not running away, but running towards me, through that confession. So I think there's probably a million ways growing up with the liturgy and the sacraments in the Catholic Church that things were embodied for me that I probably don't even know. Like it's
Yeah.
that's one of the many gifts of it, I think.
It was just kind of, yeah. And I guess as a cradle Catholic, you probably, like, did you ever have, like, when you failed, when you messed up, did you ever feel like not only a separation from God, but, like in reconciliation, the priest is actually also not only a representative of Christ, but a representative of the church. So when he says you're absolved, it's now that relationship to the church is mended, which is powerful. I think sometimes in the process, at least my experience in the Protestant uh, context, there not only was there a separation from God, but also from the church, just because they didn't know what to do with me, But once the priest, and at least in the Catholic context, says it's done, then it's kind of gone. At least in my experience, was that kind of yours as well?
Well, I wish I could say that because of all that, I would be like I grew up and lived with this feeling that like no matter what I did, I would be loved by my church and maybe for in some ways I did, but I just think it's just I don't know if I can speak for everybody about human nature, but like I think it would be kind of natural in my experience from people that I've talked to, no matter what your faith tradition is,
Yeah.
that the feeling like you need to hide,
Mhm.
the feeling like you need to present your best self, the feeling like if people really knew things about me, then they would run away. I kind of think no matter what church you grow up in, well, I can't speak for everybody,
Yeah.
but that seems as almost as universal as anything
Yeah.
in this world. But I also didn't feel like what I didn't experience, not just personally, but kind of seeing it played out in church community,
Mm.
is what I see sometimes in some of the Protestant churches on how they deal with moral failures or those kinds of things, which is, like that stuff happens. And when you see when it happens in your church and you kind of see how the church responds to it, but not just the official church, but like how people gossip about it, how people talk about it, like what happens around it. I, you know, I've just seen over the years, since most of my work is done in the evangelical church,
Yeah.
I've seen some really unfortunate responses.
Mm.
And it's a hard thing because you want to be, on one hand, you have to make a decision that is protecting your church or, whatever. But it saddens me to see what happens in those situations because I think uh, humanity, the message that gets told to other people in the congregation is like, uh, you do this and you're out.
Yeah.
Right? It's like you could preach all day long. Nothing can separate us from the love of God, except for this thing that so and so did, and this thing that so and so did,
Right.
and this thing that so and so did. And even if you can explain it and be like, well, it's not separating from the love of God. It's just like we can't, sure. But as a kid growing up in that kind of a church, you see that like nothing separates you from the love of God except for these things where people start talking about this person's,
Yeah. Absolutely.
falling off the edge of the earth.
Absolutely. I think that's,
So I,
yeah. Oh, go ahead.
no, I just don't, I don't know. I don't have experiences of that growing up where I saw that kind of stuff happen and I think really absorb the message that, oh, there really is stuff that can separate me from the love of God. Although if you talk to a lot of Catholics, a lot of people would be like, I grew up so guilt-ridden and whatever. I didn't feel that way, like the stereotypical way. I'm sure it could be in any community.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think across the board, our parents would probably, I mean, at least their generation, I feel like we're trying to scare the hell out of us for probably a good purpose. trying to keep us in trouble, but in turn, sometimes might have changed our theological perspective of God, at times, and his grace and his mercy. You seem like just like a country guy. I guess Texas is a little bit different. It's Western guy, right? Or there's kind of a
And Texas is its own thing.
yeah, yeah.
It's its own thing for sure.
But there's a lot of, especially a guy like me from Alabama. Your music's very relatable, to a Southern guy from a small town who baled hay and who did a lot of the things that you did. Do you like in those elements? What were some of the influences? Obviously, growing up in Texas, but were there some musical influences that you had that kind of the country western type influences?
Yeah, I mean, like I was full on. I mean, growing up pretty much from middle school or junior high on, I was like, I just love country music. I just
Yeah.
listen to a lot of, I mean, country and folk music.
Who's your folk bands that you
But
like?
I mean, the folk music that I listened to that probably influenced me more than anything was David Wilcox, John Gorka, Pierce Pettis,
Okay.
Martin Sexton, Patty Larkin. And that's kind of like in the 90s. So that would be like more high school
Yeah.
when I started really getting into music. But before that, just listened to a lot of country music.
Mm.
I mean, I was a huge Garth Brooks fan back in the day.
Oh yeah. Where we
But
all?
I was a kid who just like, would get the country records and I would like pour over the lyrics and look at the writers and just kind of study country songwriting. I love the storytelling of it.
Mm,
And I've always been kind of like I don't know. I kind of fancied myself back then thinking I was going to be a real cowboy.
mm.
And I would go hunting a lot and
Be on a
my life
farm.
has changed. Yeah, my life has changed quite a bit since then. I've
Yeah.
been totally sissified since moving to Nashville. But
Oh yeah. Having kids too probably helped that out too.
yeah, that does it. But yeah, for sure, country influences. And then as I started writing songs in high school, one of my cousins sent me a cassette of a David Wilcox playing at a Telluride festival in Colorado.
Mm.
And that kind of helped a shift towards like the folk music, which wasn't that different than the country, like the song structure and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. But
Tell.
it was just, there's a slight difference. And I kind of like was really drawn to that. So I certainly came into songwriting with heavily influenced by country and folk music
Yeah.
for sure.
I'd heard in an interview that you'd done recently where you said that you hoped that your songs would display who you are, or at least who you want to be. Do you feel like that's what either you started out trying to do, or that you're doing more now as you got older? Was that something that has always been a part of your music?
I think it was always part of it. And that's kind of where I think, talking about the grace and stuff in the music, where it's just like, it might just be a personality thing. I mean, the first song that I ever wrote was very like self-revealing. It was kind of like processing,
Mm.
my own feelings. So I just think it's always, I understand that I don't think every songwriter needs to be that way, but that's just kind of like what has always come out of me. It's like both as a way of connecting with my own heart and getting to know myself through the songs, but I see the songs as a point of connection, not just for myself but with other people. So it's kind of like there are a million other ways to think about songwriting, and there are probably some of them are better ways to think about songwriting. But I just like I don't ever come to songs thinking like this one. I really need something that's just going to make people dance, or something that's just like a good groove that people are gonna, I like that doesn't occur to me. It's like if I'm writing a song, it's like, well, I want to connect with myself and maybe then have it be a tool for connection with somebody else too. So that's just right or wrong. That's just how it's always been for me.
Yeah. I love your humor in songwriting. One of the first songs that I came across was I Haven't Either. And I literally laughed out loud in the first verse when you were talking about, letting your baby cry while you're playing a video game. And then I haven't either, like I died out laughing and love that humor. But then I also loved, as you move in the song, then you hit a question of, have you ever been unable to pray to God because you wonder if he exists? And you hit two emotions in one song. It was the first time I ever heard you, like completely on two different spectrums, and I thought, man, how was he able to do that? You know what I mean? To make me laugh at one point and then kind of hit me in a question that I'm feeling inside, like thinking, wow, that's a pretty powerful thing. I mean, is that kind of a technique that you have? It's kind of weaving humor into to maybe allow people to see those questions or be open to those questions that you pose?
I do think so. I mean, once again, it kind of comes from, I like to think that those two things in a song would be similar to two things in a conversation that you and I would have if we're sitting around a bonfire. Like that we would be able to joke about stuff, but then also talk about stuff that is like really serious.
Yeah.
So part of it is like that's just the way that I'm wired. But it is, you know, in songwriting things, I often talk about how much, I mean, I personally love math and I kind of see songs
Mm.
as math sometimes. And so when I look at song structure, it's not like when I'm writing a song like I Haven't Either, which I can actually remember I wrote that song on I-4 driving through I-40 here in Nashville one day. I was just thinking about like I think I started with the very first line, and then I said I haven't either, and I kind of chuckled to myself. I was like, oh, that's kind of a funny idea. I could kind of do this. How? But like if you get really nerdy into the form of that song,
Mm.
it's like quick setup. You know, have you ever been so selfish that you let your baby cry while you finish up a video game? I haven't either, right? So it's like this setup and then kind of like a punchline,
Yeah.
another setup, punchline. And so you do that enough to where people are expecting that pattern. So they expect the pattern through the whole first verse, and then there's like some kind of sarcasm in the chorus.
Mm.
And then the second verse is, have you ever made a promise to yourself 1,000 times just to break it over and over again?
Mm.
I haven't either. Only people with problems do that kind of thing. So it's like,
Yeah.
okay, he's still being funny. And then the thing about I don't remember the line about praying to God, but wondering if he even exists. So like the whole structure is to build that up. So you ask that question, um, and then when you say I haven't either, then there's kind of a sigh after it. So it's kind of like setting them up. And I think setting them up for the humor thing, people listen to it more. They're like, oh, what's the next thing gonna be? What's the next joke gonna be? And then you get to one that's like, oh, that's not funny.
Yeah.
My hope in that structure is that the humor is kind of expanding your attention
Yeah.
and interest in what you're open to so that by the time I can get to something that is serious in a weird way, I hope people would trust me more, you know, like
Absolutely.
and allow it to get in.
Yeah.
Because that works for me. I happen to love comedians, but I just be like, oh, that there's something that feels really vulnerable about it. And so yeah, it is a tool to get there. And then that song goes on after that part. There's like a the bridge is kind of like mostly serious, and at the end it's kind of like, well, one last joke, and then the rest of the song there's nothing funny about it. But I really do think that the patterns and the structure of building the quote jokes, I'm not saying they're actually jokes, I'm not saying it's that funny, but I hope it is slowly prying open a heart so that there's a deeper connection that I want to have, that the heart is already open at that point and it can
Yeah.
fall in a little bit better. I'm not saying that always works or that it's that or even that it's that intentional. I think it's just like that's the form that is kind of built into my brain.
I think sometimes looking back on preaching, that's kind of the way that we typically would come off with something funny and then kind of move to something serious. And it was kind of disarming, the audience to be open to something a little bit later. That's interesting. You definitely did. You in a lot of your songs, you've done that. I can think of More Than a Man. That one cracks me up. I mean, And then, you think of it at the end of it, as a dad of a 22-year-old and a 19-year-old, I think of, how grateful I am for the experiences of being just dad and kind of the guy that they are extremely embarrassed of at times.
Right. Totally.
But then I look back and when I was younger and a soldier and all these different things, and you're like, man, I was kind of a badass at one time.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I certainly used to be more of a badass than I am.
Yeah, and now I'm not. Now I'm the
Yeah.
guy that gets laughed at by my kids, and teenagers. Oh my God, I don't think there's a song that really hits that experience of teenage years other than that song. It's incredible. You know,
Thank you.
yeah.
A song like, I mean, Teenagers isn't as much as one where it goes back and forth to serious stuff. It's kind of like all whatever, trying to make people laugh. But sometimes I'll try to take people on that journey from serious to the deep in one song. Other funny songs I kind of see as tools in the long form of a show or a record to where,
Mm,
this is the sillier side, and then that prepares for a song later on. So not to where it all has to happen in the same song, but I think for me, just humor is just a great tool to open people up.
yeah, absolutely. There's some more serious songs that are awesome. And what's funny, dude, and I'm not just saying this for you, but like as I was writing down different songs to talk to you about, like I was literally filling up pages. I was like, I'm just basically writing his albums down. Like it's I'm gonna have to whittle these down because we only have a certain amount of time. But one of the songs, so I was a senior director of a homeless shelter for about 7 years. The song Holy Ground, what inspired you to write that song? I mean, that is probably the best expression of that group of marginalized people. And I remember hearing that just being blown away. What was kind of behind that?
Well, I was writing one day with a guy named Christopher Williams, and I think he told me talked about a story that was in a oh book I'm sure lots of people read. Not Brian McLaren, but
Reader's Digest?
yeah, Reader's no, no, it was like shoot, I can't remember the author, but it was telling a story about a church like that where homeless people had kind of broken into this old abandoned church and were living in
Mm,
there and were eventually, evicted from it. But we talked about that, and then we actually wrote a different song called Holy Ground, I think. Uh, but I came home, the story just kind of stuck with me, and so I was just kind of imagining what that was like, and then imagining like and I honestly don't remember how the original story ended up.
mm,
So I was like, how would I like this story to end up? And I
mm.
loved, it ends up with the priest who is supposed to go kick these people out of the church. He was told by his bishop or whatever that like, hey, you need to get these people out of the church. And then he shows up and he sees how they're taking care of the place. There's shiny floors beneath the sleeping bags. They'd been taking care of it in the community that was happening there, and seeing how they broke the bread together. And he was like, yeah, this is. And he asked if there's room for him to stay there. That's
Mm.
kind of like, I'm pretty sure that's not how the real story ended, but it's kind of like, oh, this is how I wish the story would end, where you could see the beauty
Yeah,
of that kind of, and thinking about breaking bread and passing around the wine, th- that has one connotation when you think about sharing the Eucharist. It
yeah,
has another connotation when you think about sitting around a trash can of fire and it's a bunch of like homeless people who are drunks passing around a bottle of wine. It's like totally, but like
yeah,
I like kind of bringing those two things together.
absolutely.
So that story was kind of aspirational in the sense of like, oh, this is how I wish the world worked. Like, here's this empty building. I kind of think that if Jesus had a choice, he'd be like, hey, yeah, let this be a home for these people,
Absolutely.
and the care at which they took care of it. So yeah, so it's just kind of a thought experiment off of a part of a story that I heard from
So
someone else.
what gave you that perspective of Jesus? Like what, and it may, this may be as just simple as reading the Bible, but what gave you that? What gave you such a compassionate, kind Jesus?
That's a good question. And honestly, you could say reading the Bible, but that wouldn't be it. There's a lot of people who read the Bible and get a totally like the Jesus that they picture in the world is totally different than that.
Yeah,
I don't know how to describe it other than just my own. I mean, some of it would have to be the ways that I was taught growing up,
yeah,
but I don't know how much like what is said in homilies on Sunday morning or in at a Josh McDowell conference. It's hard to tell what all that stuff comes together.
yeah,
But like the truth is, if it's not backed up by experience in the world and it's just a theological idea, for me, it doesn't really hold any water. It kind of has to be experienced in the world and embodied. So I think at least some of it has been my experience of people in my life, whether that's friends or getting to live in spaces where I have had great failure and people love me
mm,
in the midst of it. People sit with me the way that my friends treat me and the way that my community, my church community would treat me, even in my worst days.
mm,
I think that's what gives me that picture of Jesus. How else am I supposed to know?
yeah,
And it saddens me that not everybody gets that experience. There's some people where, on their worst day, they are abandoned by the people around them because of shame or whatever it is. That wasn't my story. Like
wasn't your experience?
I've been really loved well by the people around me and my community.
Mm,
And that's really the way that's going to shape the way that I see Jesus.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Were your parents like, my parents are very accepting and loving and kind, and I was kind of like that weird kid when I was younger that, I'd be like, why are we Christian? And they'd be like, well, because that's just what we are and what we were raised, and we believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And I'd be like, well, if I believed with that rationale, what if we were Buddhist? Like, wouldn't I just be Buddhist? And my parents wouldn't be like, you can't talk like that. You can't think like that. My parents would be like, well, why don't you pull that thread? Once you figure, and gave me kind of a space to have doubts and I think that really grew my faith. Did you kind of grow up in a similar thing like that or?
Yeah. When I think about my parents, I don't think of it as they're very devoted Christian Catholic people
Mm,
and still are.
yeah.
But I never felt like they were trying to instill in me some theology,
Mm,
right? Or it was just kind of like this is how we live. And so when I look back, my dad has always been involved in the St. Vincent de Paul Society at our church. Our church is very active
mm,
with the poor. And so like I just kind of grew up, like every holiday, every Christmas, like we're going to some part of town that I've never been to before, and we're taking a bunch of presents and meals to people. And
yeah.
we had people live in our home that were, I mean, looking back, I was like, oh, why did so and so live with us for 6 months, or why was these people? And I was like, looking back, it's like, oh, they were coming out of an abusive home or whatever it was, and just needed a space. So there are things all growing up that were just like real practical. Like for example, my dad was a lawyer who worked downtown
Mm,
in Austin
yeah.
around the Capitol, and whenever we would go downtown, if we were going to eat down there or going to some event, he'd park his car, and there'd inevitably be some homeless person wandering around. And my dad would always be like, hey John, how's the like he would know that their name or have conversations with them. He'd always kind of hang around and have
Oh,
conversations. And I
wow.
was like,
Yeah.
and he's not saying, hey kids, it's important for you to
Yeah.
see homeless people as human
You
beings.
just doing.
And he would even talk about it to us. It just be you just see him interacting with them, seeing them as human beings.
Yes.
So yeah, looking back on it, having parents that it wasn't so much like this is what Jesus is like and you need to whatever. It's just like they kind of lived it out in a lot of different ways. I was really lucky to have that example growing up.
Yeah. I guess your siblings were like that as well? Are they pretty cool? Or obviously you're not gonna, they're horrible, but
My siblings are all losers. I'm just kidding. No, I mean the funny thing is, I have three siblings, and we would generally we've landed in very different places, faith wise, just kind of like values wise, like kind of how we see the world.
yeah.
I I love them all, but we're all, came from the same place and ended up totally different spaces.
Yeah.
But there's room for all of it. It's kind of like, when we get together, it's like we're family, and it works somehow. But yeah, we're certainly, we've landed in different spots for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes I have two brothers. I have a twin brother and then I have an older brother, and we're very different. I mean, totally different. But I think sometimes the acceptance of that diversity in family, and just like they both of them would drop whatever they had to come help me at any time, but we all see the world different, all three of us. And I think that that was also something that kind of ingrained in that, to listen to people's different opinions and be able to sit with people you don't agree with. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And maybe that was from my mom and dad. You know what I mean? That kind of instilled that in us, to always be there for each other, and that, but well, that, man, that is really I can see a lot of influences of your mom and dad in your music, especially in just the way that you view people. Just with those couple of uh stories, it sounds like your dad's a really cool guy.
Yeah, they're both pretty exceptional people. My parents are, and yeah, I think seeing, but I mean, that also goes to the embodied part. I mean, like, unfortunately, we see God as some version of our dad or our mom, or some mixture of the two. And some people really luck out and get like a version. It's never going to be a perfect version. Some people get ones that are really, really, really messed up.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and I grieve that. But we're all trying to recover the real picture of God, to separate that from our parents,
yeah,
for better and worse.
yeah,
And that's one thing, coming back to the Catholic Church. I remember one time when I was speaking to a lot of Catholic songwriters, and this was at a time when there were a lot of people going through, like, big Christian people going through deconstruction and stepping away from the faith, and I would, on the road, people ask me questions about it all the time. What about so and so? What's happening? Why are I'm like, I don't know. That you have to ask them. But the conversation about deconstruction in the world of Catholic songwriters, there was no anxiety in the room. It was
mhm,
kind of like, deconstruction. That's part of spiritual formation.
yeah,
Like it was kind of like the idea that we have control over that anyways, over people and where they're going to go on that journey, is just crazy.
yes,
And so I kind of love that. My experience in the Catholic Church growing up, and my experience too now going to Anglican church, is really similar, where it's just kind of like, hey, there's space,
yeah,
and it's not, like we said, it's a pilgrimage. It's not a one-time thing. So it's like, if it's not just this one-time thing, then it's like, you've got time,
yeah,
and we're not in control over it. Like,
yeah,
the
absolutely.
idea that we have control over somebody else and what's going to happen, like, that's craziness. So
Yeah, you're
I
like, somebody has doubts, you're not going to go. And that, I feel that way in the Catholic faith. Is there, if I walked to my priest and was like, I have all these doubts about this, they're going to be like, okay, today, you know, like,
right,
think like that's who I am. You know what I mean? And
yeah, right,
it finds me. It's like, okay, that's where he is in his journey today. You know?
yeah. That that was our priest at our church that started the church that we're at, who had been my priest since 1999. He passed away 3 years ago in a tragic car accident. But he, when my oldest son was in college, like his first year of college, he was a philosophy major. And when I tell most Christians that my son is a philosophy major, they're like, "Oh my gosh, he's gonna lose his faith. He's gonna,
Go be
whatever."
agnostic.
Yeah, I'm just like, well, he might, but we'll see. And my son came back home after his first year, first semester, and was kind of disoriented. He's hearing all different kinds of things, and he's like, "What is true about, like?" And he goes to meet with Father Thomas, and Thomas was just like, he listened to him. He's like, "Hey, Drew, if you weren't feeling that way right now, it would be a little bit crazy. Like, that's totally the way that you're supposed. Like, that's awesome,
Yeah,
and there's nothing wrong with the way that this disorientation that you're feeling right now. Like, that's totally normal."
yeah,
And for him to have somebody like that in his life, I mean, hopefully his mom and I were that way too, but like, to have a representative of the church say that to him, it really kind of took away this feeling like, well, I either have to be this or I have to be this. And
Yes.
it allowed him to just trust his own experience. And I think he's way better off for it. And I wish that that was everybody's experience in church, that there wasn't this anxiety of like, well, if he does this, then we're going to lose him from the church.
Yeah.
I'm kind of like, that very thing, I think, is what makes people leave the church. That it's
Yes.
just kind of like this constricting thing.
Absolutely.
And God, my experience of God is just way more like, oh, you want to, all right, let's go.
Yeah.
Let's explore that.
Let
That's
them
fine.
grow. Let them be who they are. Let them, so who someone's going to be today may not even be who they are 6 hours from now, or 20 years from now. You got to let them kind of grow in and think about those things. Don't just like stuff them down. So yeah, what's real funny is my sons, and they probably laugh about this, but I'm so introspective and like questioning everything, and neither one of my boys are like that. They're like, just kind of like taking it, you know, at face value and stuff. And so I'll be like having conversations with them, like, "What do you think about this?" And they're like, "Yeah, that's cool, Dad." Whatever. Yeah, that's cool. And I'll be like, I'll be talking to their mom. I'm like, "How are they not thinking about this?" So I'm
Right.
probably the opposite way, wanting them to think, a little bit
Right.
outside the box, which is funny. I know we're getting close to time. One reason why we're doing this whole podcast is to give people really some hope. Maybe they it's called wandering home, and we're hoping that everyone's just wandering home, just like what we're talking about right now. And probably your music is wonderful for someone who is maybe going through something tragic or having questions or doubts. And one of the songs that I think pinpoints that is Not Too Late. Man, what a wonderful song. What's the background behind that song? Like, what's the story behind it? Is I know you had said at one time you had a friend that you wrote that for.
Yeah, I was writing it for a friend who, as people do, had made some decisions that had some hard consequences to his family and his marriage and his work. And it was kind of at the place of feeling like, is it possible to turn around and make this, like it's either like I'm just going to keep going the way that I'm going, or I'm going to have to figure out if there's a way to heal
Mm,
all the damage that I've done. And I got the feeling that he couldn't see that there's any possible way of going back and healing that with his family, with his wife, of restoring what had been broken.
mm,
And to me, that song was like, I often talk about that song as like having, I mean, you're probably like this where you've heard a lot of stories in your life, and his particular story I had heard many times before.
yeah,
And so like, I'm not in the weeds of it. He's in the weeds of it, and he can't see a way out. And I'm like, hey, I can have hope for you because I've seen this story before. There's a million ways back. There's a million ways to restoration. And it's certainly not ever going to look like what you think it's going to look like, but you don't have to know so many ways back.
yeah,
And that's really what I was trying to convey with that song for the friend, is just to say, hey, it's like, it's coming back to what we were talking about before. I
yeah,
really believe you're never too far gone. There's literally, if God says there's nothing that can separate us from his love, he means nothing, like nothing.
yeah,
And that's kind of what I wanted to say. And I've also said a number of times that about that song in particular, um, that I kind of think that I'm writing it for somebody else.
mm,
But there have been a lot of times for me just
mm,
where that song has been what I needed.
yeah,
Particularly, the end of the song is just there's kind of a litany of things that it's not too late for. And it's just good to remind myself that, like, it reminds me that in my worst moments, right, that I'm a really bad predictor of the future.
yeah,
Like, a real general way of saying it is kind of the classic, oh, if people knew this about me, they would fill in the blank. They'd run, or they would whatever. That's a way of predicting the future. But there's also a way of predicting, oh, if I kind of like come clean about this, then all this stuff is going to happen. Or if I apologize for this, then that means that I have to take ownership for this, but then they're not going to take ownership for this, or whatever it is.
mm,
I start thinking like, I know the story is a foregone conclusion.
mm,
And I have to remind myself, like my experience in the world is all those times when I thought I knew what was going to happen if I took some sort of action. Not only was I wrong, but what happens on the other side of that is like far better than I could have ever imagined,
Yeah.
And that's kind of like coming back to, the sacrament of confession. It's kind of like, I think, oh, well, what good could come of this? I'm going to do this. I'm going to be embarrassed. I'm going to like somebody else, and then he's going to think I'm going to, whatever. And then on the other side of that is always like, oh, there's like this freedom and connection that I really longed for, that I thought doing this act was going to separate me from that, but it was my way to that. So
Yeah.
that song to me is like a big reminder that I'm not a good predictor of the future, and it's never too late to turn it around.
Well, it's a awesome theme, for really anybody. I mean, we're all going through things, whether they're public or private, or, I know, or we're a narcissist and we don't think we're going through anything, but yeah, I appreciate you, man. I appreciate you being really the background music for many of us who are wandering home and coming back to God, and hearing a voice that's saying it's not too late and you can come back. I appreciate you doing that. If I hope our listeners, most of them probably already know you, but to check out your music and really find the hope of Christ in it. But Andy, man, I would love to do this again sometime and just kind of
Yeah, it's great talking to you.
pull the thread.
I'd love to hear more about your journey too, to down the Roman road. That's pretty exciting. I'd love to
Yeah,
hear more about
across
that too.
the Tiber, man.
Yeah,
But yeah, well, I appreciate you coming on, man, and I look forward to hearing from you again sometime, maybe in the near future.
awesome. Thank you so much.